Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about your account ledger flow. And we have about 130 people who have registered, and I see that they're still trickling in. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of you. It's so awesome to have you here, and I'm excited you're wanting to learn how to fine-tune your Rentec direct account skills. So my name is Janelle, for those of you I haven't met, but I've sure had the joy of working with so many of you over the years, and I just want to welcome all of our newbies, those that are first using Rentec for the very first time, or this is your first webinar. So I also want to introduce Catherine. Catherine is joining me today from behind the camera, and she's here to answer any questions you might have. We want you to all feel like you can reach out to your team, whether you're in the webinar right now or you're working in your account later. So we're here to help you. I just love working with Catherine. She's fun to work with. She's got just a sharp sense of humor, but she's also really knowledgeable about your industry and about your software that you're using. So she is going to be a great resource for you if you haven't yet connected with her. And I want to point out all of your interactive webinar tools that are going to be found in the upper right corner of your screen. So just know that your question and chat messages that you send over today, those can be viewed by all of us in the room. So those are open for us to view, and it's kind of fun that way. Just to connect with Catherine during the webinar so that you can ask her a specific question, make sure you use that questions tab. The chat tab that you see there, those are going to be for, that's going to be for shouting out answers to questions that I just throw out to all of you. So, and just click on over to that survey tab and see how you measure up to, your peers that are joining today. It's fun to see how your answers compare. So I anticipate this webinar is going to run about 25-30 minutes. So we're recording it for you so that you can rewatch it later if you want to, or if you want to share it with any teammates that are using your account with you. So we post these recordings on our Rentec Direct YouTube page, and it's done typically the day after the webinar is live. So check out that YouTube page for any past events that are going to pique your interest or you want to learn more about. So I'm going to share a lot of information with you today related to your account ledgers, but tell me, how many of you here today have been confused with either how to locate or read or just understand your account ledgers? I want you to click on that polls tab and let Catherine and I know, as well as let your peers know they're not alone. So just let us know if you're a landlord or if you're working in a property manager capacity too. That helps us see, who is interested in learning about this information we're presenting today. So the general definition of a ledger is just a record used to store bookkeeping entries. And when you're handling property management activity in your Rentec Direct account, you'll have bookkeeping entries either for income or expenses for your tenants, your properties, your bank accounts. And if you're in the PM version of Rentec, you'll have entries for property owners as well. So let's be sure you know where each of your ledgers are located. So all ledgers are located in the subjects page, meaning a property, a tenant, a bank account, or a property owner account. And they can be opened by just clicking on the ledger balance that you see on that page. And tenants have both a standard ledger and a security deposit ledger. And that can be found just at the top of the standard ledger. So when you're in there, you'll see that button. When recording income and expenses, many times a transaction will need to be connected to more than one ledger. And I want to take you through the different scenarios so you have a solid understanding of how all your ledgers are tied together, okay? So there are 4 types of ledgers available in Rentec Direct accounts. There are tenants, properties, property owners, and bank accounts. And under typical management, a majority of your transactions are going to show up in multiple ledgers. So a note for our pro clients, you're not going to have a property owner ledger, as it's implied that all the properties are yours. So when you hear me talking about property owner ledgers or property owners, just know this relates to the PM version of Rentec Direct. And this is because they're breaking out expenses by ownership entity, not just property. So you might have to just take a little coffee break while I mention property owners, okay? So there are bookkeeping entries that only apply to tenants. I want to break this down for you how transactions apply. So some are only for tenants, such as a tenant charge. So if a tenant charge is entered through the tenant page, by default, it's only going to appear in the tenant ledger. So system generated recurring rent charges that were created when you moved your tenant in to a property, those are an example of this. So there are only a few instances when a bookkeeping entry would only apply to a property ledger, as most income and expense transactions are going to be linked to a bank account they apply to, which one it was paid out of, and the property owner that the property is owned by. There are a couple exceptions. One is for, our pro clients. When pro clients enter a starting balance for a property or they transfer funds between properties, those transactions only apply to the property. So there are instances when a transaction would only apply to a bank account, such as bank fees or interest on your bank account. If you enter a bank-only transaction, you're going to do that through the accounts page, and just be sure to leave the tenant and property fields listed as none. So if you are a property manager and you're working in the PM version, keep in mind that transactions for property owners will always be tied to at least a property. So there are no property owner only transactions. They're always going to be tied to at least a property. And, beyond transactions isolated to a single ledger, most transactions, remember I mentioned, they're going to be tied to multiple ledgers within your Rentec Direct account. An example of this is a tenant rent payment. So if you've set up your account properly and you've tied the default bank account and the property owner to that property's page where the tenant lives, the income recorded through the tenant's ledger just automatically flows to the property the tenant lives in, the property owner, and the bank account that is linked to that property where you deposited that payment. So you don't have to post any additional transactions to have this tenant payment recorded in all those connected ledgers, which is super convenient, right? Likewise, there are property expenses that will tie in multiple ledgers, such as a vendor expense for a repair. When the property ledger incurs the expense, so will the property owner and the bank account ledgers if you've linked those in to your property setup page. And if you're billing your tenant for a property expense, know that you can just link that tenant right into the transaction. So to verify if you've set up your property correctly for ledger flow, just edit your property in the property page and check that the property owner and the bank accounts are linked into your property page. Now, I know some of you out there have a question you're just waiting to ask, and maybe you've already asked Catherine while I've been talking, but you have a question about an additional ledger. So you might be asking yourself, hey, what about my company ledger? I have expenses that are not property related, such as office supplies. And before I offer you my tip, I would love it if all of you would just shout out through that chat tool that's on your webinar screen what you each do currently to track those business-only expenses that are not tied to a specific property. So click that chat button and tell us what you do with those business expenses. All right, so while you're sharing what you're currently doing, and Catherine can be reading that, I want to point out that it's just very easy to record those business-only transactions in your Rentec Direct account. And maybe some of you are already doing this, but I want to point it out. It's just as simple as posting a transaction to a bank account ledger. So simply add in the bank account you use for your company and then record the income or expenses there. And just leave the property and the tenant field, if you see those there, just leave those set to none. So now that you're clear on how your ledgers are connected and how those transactions flow, I just want to talk about the individual ledger entries just in more depth so you're really confident on how this is all connected. So first, let's review tenant ledgers, as there are two ledgers that are tied to tenants. First, there is the standard ledger where we see, our rent charges and our rent payments. And then there's the security deposit ledger that you can access from the top of that standard ledger. And you just click that on deposit button. So in the standard tenant ledger, you're going to notice that there's a filter in the upper corner. It's going to help you isolate date ranges or any data that's found in the ledger. So this is found in all your account ledgers, and it's just really helpful when you're trying to find information. So don't forget your filters. You're also going to see charges and payments within a ledger. This activity can be triggered automatically, or it can be entered manually by you or one of your sub-users in your account. So automatic transactions are going to be things like monthly rent or other recurring tenant charges, possibly some late fees if you've set up your automatic late fee tool. You're also going to see any online tenant rent payments if you're using Easy Pay or the cash payment tool. Those are going to be automatically recorded. Now, manual transactions are going to be monthly charges that are kind of one time, like maybe non-refundable fees or maybe some damages you're billing your tenant for. So, or any of those physical rent payments you receive, cash or check or money order in your office. When you're looking at a tenant ledger, you should only see tenant related transactions. So if you see charges in your tenant's ledger that are meant for the property, you're going to want to investigate why they're in your tenant ledger and, learn how to avoid that in the future, which I'm going to explain that later. So notice that tenant charges are going to use the category of 110 charge. That is the program default for tenant charges. And it's just specific to tenants only. The other categories for expenses, those are for properties, and you're not going to be using those for your tenants, okay? So I'm going to move on over now to property ledgers so we can talk about that. Just a little note about the single units versus the multi-unit buildings. So if you're managing multi-unit rentals in Rentec, the master ledger, meaning that one that's straight across from the property name, that's going to contain a accumulation of activity that's recorded for your entire property, meaning property-wide expenses or income, as well as those entries that are done at the unit level. So much like the rules with a tenant ledger, a property ledger should contain property-specific activity, such as rental income received, management fees that are assessed, property expenses, and those property owner disbursements that you do each month. So if you notice a tenant rent charge, that's listed on the property ledger, you're going to want to edit and remove the property name from the transaction because tenant charges should not appear on a property ledger. And you're also going to notice when you're in a property ledger that there are memo notes and there are vendors that you've linked into transactions and categories that you've used for that transaction. Those are going to be displayed in your ledger. And if you're managing those multi-unit buildings, you're going to also notice those subunit transactions that I mentioned. They're going to have the subunit name listed. So it's really easy to view where that activity is from. If there isn't a unit number listed, just know that was a property-wide transaction rather than a unit-specific one. Now, property owners' ledgers are going to mirror the activity that's found in that owner's properties. So including property charges, tenant payments, property owner contributions, and property owner disbursements. So if the property owner has more than one property that you're managing for them, it's going to be easy for you to notice, where the transaction is coming from, because remember that property name is going to be listed in the transaction. As I mentioned before, bank account ledgers can contain transactions that relate to the bank account, but also the tenant and the property owner. So before we move forward, let me check in with y'all. Are you following me? Are you, absorbing all this information that I'm sharing? For our old timers, all of this probably feels pretty familiar because you've been working in your account, but maybe some of you are challenged, and I'm glad you're here. But don't forget, you can shout out to Catherine, any questions you have about what I've covered so far, about, the where and the how of your ledgers. I'm going to move us over into the specifics of the ledger entries, your settings, and some of your report tools that are going to assist you with your ledgers. So recording ledger entries are done through the pages in your account that the transaction applies to. Makes sense, right? So granted, each transaction may flow to other ledgers, but let the subject be your guide when you're getting ready to post your transaction. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if it's a tenant charge or a payment, just head to the tenant page and use the option in the menu or the payment icons you're going to see right below the balance there. So if you know it's a tenant payment, even though it'll apply to the property and apply to the bank account, start over on the tenant page to enter that payment. And again, tenant charges should use the category of 110 charge. So if you're posting a tenant charge, make sure you leave that default at 110 charge. You can also add in a memo line that's going to help you, decipher your ledger down the road if you have a tenant for, many months or years. And you're going to notice that you can also make attachments to your transactions. That's for tenants and properties and accounts. So if a charge is to be a new recurring charge, maybe you're going to start charging them pet rent. They brought on a little kitty cat. You can just select that option within that transaction screen. If you're recording an individual tenant payment, you're going to want to do this through the tenant page. I've mentioned that before, but this is especially important for our property managers to remember, because one of the automated management fee features that we have in the software is triggered by a tenant payment. So it's recorded through the tenant ledger, and if you post that payment through the property ledger, that option isn't going to kick in. So remember that. A tenant payment can be split into different categories. You can use that add a line option. So if you want to break out a tenant payment for, rent, and then a portion of it they're paying a late fee, you can do that. And if you're a PM, just notice the management fee option. It can be based on a payment, but it can also be deselected. So if some reason your payment shouldn't trigger a management fee, or a portion of that split payment shouldn't trigger a management fee, you can just uncheck that box. So at the bottom of that tenant payment transaction, just notice that we've pointed out you can post multiple tenant transactions through the account page. So if it's not just for one tenant, you can click on over to the accounts page. And this is really helpful, I think, around the beginning of the month. You've got your stack of payments, your checks, and you can go over to your accounts page, and it's just going to save you some time. Just simply choose the option to post a payment, and it's across from the bank account name, and then your payments are going to be recorded in that bank ledger in a batch. Just complete all the fields for each transaction, and if you haven't used this batch tool yet, just check it out. It's really cool. So you can find detailed instructions right in your knowledge base. So check that out in your knowledge base, and it'll walk you through for the first time. And there's also a recorded webinar and training video related to the batch transaction tool. So if you have a transaction that is property-based, like a payment to a vendor for work they did, you're going to want to do that through the property page, and you're going to use the menu option or the icon that's below the balance. And a few items that I want to point out about property transactions, just be sure to always complete all the fields that are in the transaction screen, as they affect your financial reports And we really want your financial reports to be as meaningful as possible to you. So just taking the time to complete each of those fields is going to help you in the long run. Don't forget to link your bank account to the transaction, the vendor that you're using, even where maybe you bought some supplies at Home Depot, and you have to reference that later. Just make sure you link in where that expense is coming from. Also, the category, that's important as it flows into your income and expense reports. And again, if you have a tenant that's part of that expense, you can link them in there. If it's not billed to the tenant, again, don't list them. It's not required that you put a tenant in there unless you are actually billing your tenant. So remember that batch tool I mentioned for multiple tenant payments? You can also use that batch tool for multiple property transactions. So when you're posting a property transaction through the account page, you're going to notice that each of those individual transactions can be split, meaning it can have one vendor but be broken into multiple properties. But it's also for posting, multiple transactions at one time, so you don't have to go back to each individual property and post an expense at each property level. So this batch tool is very helpful. And if you do have transactions that only apply to a bank account, you'll also do these through the accounts page. Just remember, leave the property at none if the transaction only applies to the bank account. All right, I know some of you that are here today are brand new to Rentec, or again, some of the clients that have been with us for a while. I just want to offer a couple tips to you that relate to ledger flow, that kind of step outside of these general rules. So I hear from time to time that clients are concerned that they don't see their management fees that are in their property ledger. They don't see them in their bank account ledger, and they know that they have linked the default bank account for their property. So this is for my property managers out there. Don't be worried. The reason why is twofold. So some clients, and maybe you're one of them, assess a management fee to the property, but they don't actually pay the funds out to themselves. They just leave that income in their bank account. So that's why it's not linked to the bank account, right? Other clients that do pay themselves each month for management fees, they don't want to have, lots of individual entries. They want to show one transaction in the bank ledger that they paid themselves, one check, or they transferred funds out of that bank account in one entry for multiple property management fees. So that is why. Let's take a look at your various settings that are going to affect your ledger transactions. So the first setting I want to point out is going to be found in your property page. And the property settings are very important as they're going to help automate the flow of all your property transactions. So in the financial section of your property page, be sure to link in which bank account you want your transactions to apply to, because if you skip this section, if you're just trying to be quick and adding a property, you're going to run the risk of forgetting to link a bank account into every transaction you post. And if that happens, reconciliation is going to be really challenging. So if you're a PM, property manager, make sure you link in the property owner, because we want all those property transactions linked to that owner so that your property owner reports that you provide them are accurate. And the last item is, if you're a property manager and you want to make sure your management and placement fees are automatically set so that they flow automatically for you. So link those into the property page. Know that you have to check the box to make that fee apply. Some people just enter the percentage or the amount and they forget to check the box. So make sure you do that. Another important setting that's going to affect your ledger, those are found in your accounting defaults in your settings page. So these settings are going to affect how negative amounts are going to be displayed in your ledgers and negative balances. When you're recording a rent charge and how your late fees are going to appear in ledgers, that's going to be dictated by this accounting default page. Also, which categories by default are going to be used for deposit transfers and owner disbursements and owner contributions. So don't skip over your accounting defaults. be sure to look into your advanced program default settings, which is found by clicking on the link at the bottom of your program defaults page. So there's one page, but scroll down to the bottom. Most of us here at Rentec Direct prefer seeing more information about transactions, like transaction memo notes, transaction splits and ledger reports, and categories and check numbers. We like to see those details. If you don't enable them. But decide what's important to you. And another thing you want to consider is, how do you want your security deposit activity or voided bank deposits, how do you want those to appear in your reports or your ledgers? So those advanced program defaults are going to help you with that. And if you are not sure what each one of those means, just hover over those little question marks you see, as it's going to give you a little additional information to help guide your decision. So beyond the ledgers themselves, there are financial reports in your account that are going to dig into your ledger activity, and I want to share those with you. So I've highlighted the financial reports that are all about ledgers. So notice the filters and the legend that's on that left side of this page, and they're going to help you search for specific information. So reports can be pulled by an individual property or by a specific unit or by an entire multiplex, or all your properties, by bank account, by property owner, and then by a date range. So you can toggle those options to get pretty specific in those reports. The account ledger report, this one is especially useful when you're wanting to look at activity, ledger activity for all your properties at once, or you're wanting to look at your transactions for a specific time period. It's helpful to just drill it down through the report tool. And I like the account ledger B report over the A report, just because it contains more information. And again, I like to have as much information as possible. Some of you just want to have the basics and you choose the account ledger A report. So it's just easy to scan this report and you can see if any information might be missing from your transactions, like maybe categories or properties or a vendor. And you can see your balance for any given date in your account ledger report. So the category ledger report that I've highlighted there for you is one that I just really love. It's my go-to when I'm helping a client find why their transaction totals are off in their income and expense reports. So those summary reports don't give you a detail of every transaction, where the category ledger does. It basically lets you look at all the transactions in a given time period for a specific category. Like maybe you want to see who you collected late fee income from for the whole year. You can, pull this report for that. Or maybe you need to know, why your repair expenses are so high for a certain month. Or maybe an owner wants you to quickly tell them how much you've paid out to them for the year, and on which days did you do it. The category ledger report is going to be helpful. So when you're in this report, if you need to make a change to an individual entry, just know you could click on the blue dollar amount and it'll take you right to that transaction, so you can edit it, or if you need to, delete it. So we have one financial report that looks at tenant activity, and it's called the multi-tenant ledger. So if you're not looking at just one tenant, through their individual ledger, you can look at many tenants' ledgers at once. And I see clients use this report if they want to scan through all their tenant charges and payment activity for a given time period. Or maybe they want to see tenants paid, who's paid rent before the second of the month, or, maybe they want to look at, who was assessed late fees for that particular month. I just like to point this out. The multi-tenant ledger is helpful. It's also good if you want to see just activity for one particular multi-unit building. So take a look at this if you need to look at more than one tenant activity for any given time period. Another ledger report you may want to look at that relates specifically to vendor activity. So it's a vendor ledger. Maybe you need to know how much have you paid out to one particular vendor, across all of your properties. Or maybe you have an invoice in front of you and you swear you already paid it for that particular vendor. The vendor ledger is going to be useful. So the next topic I want to bring up is if you ever need to export out your ledger transactions, maybe you need to manipulate your, your numbers that are in your reports. You want to do that outside of the software for some reason. Just know it's really easy to do. You're just going to open up any of your ledgers, and if you just scroll to the bottom of the page, you're going to use that download this data link, and your ledger is going to export in a CSV file format. Another way you can export ledger activity is through your reports. So each of your reports, you might have noticed, can be printed, they can be emailed, put into a PDF, but they can also be converted into a CSV file. And if any of you are using QuickBooks side by side with your Rentec direct account, exporting the account ledger B report by bank account is going to provide you an easy summary, and it's an easy way to copy that data from your Rentec direct account over to your QuickBooks account. Well, we all want to avoid mistakes if we can, right? So your client success team has answered thousands of client questions this year alone, and many of them are related to account mistakes. And I want to share with you, what we find are the most common mistakes that clients make so that you can avoid them. A common mistake we've seen happen is when a client edits a tenant rent charge. So Kevin on your support team asked me to mention this one for all of you. If you're wanting to reflect a tenant payment, don't edit a charge and change the transaction type from a credit to a debit by using the buttons in the transaction. So some newbies believe this is how you can, easily show a tenant payment. And this is not how you want to do it. Kevin wanted me to tell you that. So one, you want to leave the charge in the tenant's ledger so their balance is accurate. And it tells the financial story to you and to them. But also, the category would be incorrect. And then that payment is not going to populate over to your income reports. So don't do that. Another mistake we see is when clients are in edit mode and they start changing the fields that are linked in, such as the property or the bank account or the tenant. When you're in edit mode, just be really careful about which fields that you are changing. System generated charges, they already include all the appropriate fields, so you're not going to want to change those. But if you get stuck, I want to share a question that Catherine and I have used over the years with many clients, and it's very simple. And that is, what happened in the real world? Just ask yourself this question, such as, do I need to bill my property for this rent charge? No. Do I need to list a bank account for a tenant charge? No. So it may seem silly to ask yourself these questions, but we found it really does help. So if you get stuck, ask yourself that question. Another biggie that we see clients doing is changing categories in a transaction. Say from the tenant's default category of 110 charge, they change it to a property expense category, or maybe an income category. Another very common error we see is editing recurring transactions that automatically flow into your ledger. So editing a recurring transaction through your settings, it's an advanced skill, and there are many fields that can be toggled, and each one, it plays a real important role in your ledgers and your reports. So if you do not do this, if you don't complete it correctly, you're going to end up with charges showing up in the wrong ledgers or on the wrong days, or worse yet, maybe they won't appear at all. So there's a training video that's dedicated to settings that can help you. There's also information in your knowledge base, or just reach out to your client success team. We want you to be successful, so don't just go winging it if you need to edit a recurring transaction. So another common mistake related to ledgers is deleting a transaction before fully understanding how it affects a ledger. So for example, if you made a bank deposit and afterwards you realized you posted a payment to the wrong tenant ledger, don't just delete a payment, as that's going to mess up your bank ledger, right? That one seems pretty obvious. But the one I really want to point out right now is related to deleting a recurring transaction from a ledger, such as a rent charge. So if you delete a recurring charge from a ledger, it's not going to repost on another day. Um, I see this happen most often when a tenant moves into a rental and the manager notices there are two rent charges in the tenant ledger, one for a prorate for the first month and then another one for the second month. And for a variety of reasons, I see a manager delete one of those charges, thinking that they're going to repost automatically, maybe in that next month, and they're not going to. Once it's deleted, it's gone out of that ledger. But you can always repost it manually, but again, it's not going to repost for you automatically. Also, if a recurring transaction is wrong, if you delete it from the ledger, that recurring activity isn't going to stop altogether until you delete it from your settings. So if you want to delete a recurring transaction completely, it must be done through your settings page. So speaking of that deleted rent charge that you might have done, if you delete that recurring rent charge from a tenant ledger, when you go to manually post that charge again for that particular month that you didn't mean to delete it, make sure it's a single time charge. Don't select that recurring option again, or else you're going to have two recurring transactions in your settings, right? All right, remember those settings we reviewed earlier that are going to help your ledger activity flow perfectly? Well, as you might imagine, if those settings are not in place, they can create mistakes in your ledgers. So that is another common mistake. Just make sure you manage your property, accounting, and program default settings, and you review your recurring transactions in your settings just to make sure that things are working as you desire. If they're not, it could be related to one of those particular settings. And this happens more often than you would think when it comes, and it comes up a lot when clients are trying to reconcile their Rentec direct account and they wonder why their ledgers aren't correct. So just be sure to review each of your transactions as you're recording them and be sure you have completed each of those fields. A common missing field we see is the bank account. In this example, a tenant payment was recorded on the tenant ledger and the bank account was not linked in. And this, of course, is going to throw off your bank ledger. So same thing when posting a property expense. Be sure to link in bank accounts, categories, amounts. Basically, just keep an eye on all those fields. And here is a ledger of a tenant that hasn't paid their rent for 3 months. Yuck! Yuck. But what's also a problem here is that the late fees aren't listed, you can see. And that's because the accounting defaults were not managed. So let me ask you this, and shout out your answers through the chat tool. This is your chance to tell me. Do you feel like you can easily locate mistakes that you or maybe another sub-user in your account might have made? Tell us the truth. And if you can, let us know what you do. Just light up that chat tool in your webinar screen. I want to hear what you guys have to say. So, we've covered a lot of information, but one of the biggest takeaways I want to share with you today is how to find your mistakes, because everyone makes them at one time or another. So let's get in the habit of scanning our ledgers. Now you know what should be in your ledgers based on those completed fields and your various settings. Just keep an eye out for those missing or incorrect information every time you've opened up a ledger. Just make it a habit to scan it. For example, look for transactions that are uncategorized. Look to see if there are transactions in your bank ledger without a property name. Make sure that those are bank specific. They're going to start standing out to you if you intentionally look at those areas. Get familiar with how a tenant ledger should look so you can spot errors. For example, this tenant transaction was originally a recurring rent charge, but someone edited it and changed it to a credit. Remember I told you that's a common mistake that people make? So I can tell this quickly because it has the 110 charge, the default description of rent, and it has that date range. That's typically what I see in a recurring rent charge. But charges should show up in the debit column. And payments don't have a 110 charge category. So that's just a common thing I see in ledgers when I'm helping clients. So review your recurring transactions and look for those manually created transactions like the one I've highlighted here. If you think you have a duplicate recurring transaction, you can use the filter in this screen, or the F3 key in on your keyboard to search out for any suspected duplicates, and you can delete those as necessary using that red X if it's needed to be deleted. So review your transaction history, and you can do this under your settings to see if there have been any edits or deletes that you're not aware of, and it's found by entering the utilities in your settings, and then you'll see that transaction history listed there in utilities. And then you can use the filters that are in the screen to drill down your transaction. And that little blue arrow, it's going to, if you click on it, you can view the details of your transaction that's in a ledger. So Catherine wanted me to share her go-to tip she offers clients that are trying to isolate a transaction error. So maybe you found that your income and expense reports for the year or for the quarter, for the property, for all your properties, isn't matching what you show in your bank account. So here is what she recommends. First, pull 2 operating statement B reports, one for all your properties, and then one for the corresponding bank account. Now, you're going to find the month in which you have a difference in that report for those category totals. So you look across each category and compare them. Now, when you find it, remember the category and the month in which that variance occurred. And then you're going to head on over and you're going to pull 2 category ledger reports for that specific category and that specific month. And it's going to be one for all properties and one for your bank account. And you're going to compare these line items side by side, each transaction one at a time, until you find where they're different. And once you find that variance, you can just edit that transaction and you can correct the wrong or missing information. So in this example, when I'm looking at these reports, it looks like the transaction that I've circled on the report was recorded for a property, but it was not recorded for the bank. And if I click on that transaction in the report, I can see that indeed the transaction is missing the bank account that the payment was deposited into. So right there, I can easily add the bank account to the transaction and I can save my changes. Thanks, Catherine, for that tip. And here is also the gold standard tip for finding ledger mistakes that you don't even know have happened. So conduct a 3-way reconciliation each and every month. 3-way reconciliation takes into account all your transactions in your Rentec direct account and compares it to your bank account transactions, and it helps you easily find if there's a discrepancy. It's important to do this each month rather than wait until the end of the year, because ask Catherine or anyone on your client success team, it can be painful finding mistakes if there are many mistakes spread across multiple months and multiple properties. It's just easier if you do it every month. And if you're ever audited, you're going to be glad that you did it monthly. This worksheet can be found at the link that I have listed here. And if you need help understanding this process, just reach out to your client success team. So before we say goodbye, I want to invite you to our next webinar. It's next month, and it's definitely going to help you with all those tasks you have when it comes time to move a tenant out of your rental. So I hope you'll join us. It's going to be exciting. We did it. Yay! Great job learning. Thank you so much for being here today and for being part of the Rentec Direct family. We really appreciate you. And Catherine, you're the best. I appreciate your help always. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. We want to help make your workday better and your job easier and just ensure that you get the most out of your software. So have a fantastic day, friends. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.